My government's fiscal policy will focus first on reining in government spending. At the same time, we will focus on catalyzing unprecedented levels of private investment across Canada.
He's planning to cook the books with a sneaky accounting trick to take billions of dollars of new Liberal spending off the budget records altogether.
And part of the reason how we've ended up in these times is because of a certain type of politician perfecting their art, which is focused on slogans, slander, sound bites.
I noticed that Mr. Carney uses a lot of slogans. He has been sloganeering his entire leadership campaign while I've been laying out real concrete policy plans.
Neck and neck. There are still 2 weeks left in the Liberal leadership race, but Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre has his sights set on presumptive frontrunner Mark Carney, as you heard there. New polling this week also shows the Liberals continuing to close the gap with the Tories, who've been nearly double digits ahead for almost 2 years, but could now be tied or close to it, depending on the poll, if Carney were to become leader. The race's hopefuls, meanwhile, are set to square off in 2 debates this week, in French tomorrow, in English Tuesday, both in Montreal. Plus, speculation is swirling that the winner could be angling to seize on the party's current momentum and call a snap election soon thereafter. So what is the state of this race, and what are the takeaways for each party if we are headed for a general election call within the month? Our Sunday strategy session is here to talk about that. Shannon Phillips is a former NDP MLA and cabinet minister in Alberta. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister, and Scott Reid is a CTV News political analyst, as well as former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody. It's very good to see you. Thanks for making the time. James, I'll start with you, because Conservatives for the past few weeks have been saying, look, Carney's got this momentum because he's untested, essentially. He's not getting a lot of pushback or scrutiny to the degree that other political leaders are or have been. Will these debates change that, do you think?
They could well. He is largely untested. I joke that there are 3 great love affairs in history, Romeo and Juliet, Will and Kate, and Mark Carney in the national media. He has been largely untested. He hasn't exposed himself to a lot of interviews. The debates will matter. The challenge for Mark Carney is to show that he can withstand some pressure, because he hasn't been there at all. This is not a rookie job, being the prime minister of the country and leader of a national political party. And a lot of people don't survive the scrutiny, and that's the standard for him to meet.
So I'm very curious, Scott, what you think the debates will what will unfold during the debates. Only because, first of all, they're going to be 2 hours. They're quite long. Normally, front runners are on the defense, but these are not, people from other political parties. It's other fellow Liberals who ultimately want to see the party succeed in the election. So do you think they go at him hard, or is it with kid gloves?
I think they're probably going to reserve their fire mostly for Pierre Poilievre, but there will inevitably, over the course of 2 hours, be some scraps. But that's not really what the test of the debate's going to be. The test of the debates will be how Mark Carney performs in French. I think that's going to be the thing that people will watch for. And, I just look at the dynamic of the polling in Quebec. If there's been momentum toward the Liberals, it began in Quebec, and I think it's because there's a recognition that traditional questions of sovereignty, independence, those things are all getting washed away by the threat, the external threat that Donald Trump poses, and the Quebec economy and workers there feel it very sharply. So they're looking at Carney. They're attracted by his resume. They think he seems like an adult in the room. And the question is, can he connect with them, at least in passable French? And so I bet when he was watching that game the other night, he was pronouncing McDavid with a French accent, because he has been training in French, I'm sure, week after week, day after day, getting ready for Monday.
What do you think, Shannon, or what's your impression about why Mark Carney is in the position he is relative to the other candidates? Is it a lack of scrutiny, or is there something else at play?
Well, when you look at the numbers, what Mark Carney is doing is he's pulling from a little bit from the Conservatives, but mostly from the NDP and to a certain extent the Bloc. And so that's what some of those polls this week have shown. So what he's going to have to do in the debate is essentially walk that line to make some of those progressive voters who are looking for a progressive alternative happy with where they are parking at least some of their vote right now, but keep some of that center-right and business liberal coalition that he has built his reputation on, and even some of his policy offerings with respect to size of the federal public service, deficit reduction, and so on. So he has a line to walk that he is going to be taking into the general if he is the presumptive front runner. And that's what he's going to have to prove in the debates next week, in addition to, as Scott says, his fluency in French.
Let's talk about the potential for a general. It's not just speculation. James, there's been a number of times which reporters have asked Mark Carney, is that something you do if you do become the leader? And he certainly has done the opposite of closing the door on that possibility. So your view on the chances of an election soon after there is a winner in this Liberal leadership race, and what are the implications for opposition?
Strategically, it makes sense to me, and I think it's appropriate democratically. Look, Mark Carney, he's not only never received a single vote from a single Canadian ever before, he's never even sought to get a vote from a Canadian ever before in any election. He's not a member of Parliament. He's never sought to be a member of Parliament before. So to become the Prime Minister of the country without any kind of democratic influence and oversight by the Canadian people, I think, is important. So that's reason one. Reason two to go to the polls right away is the Conservatives have a huge fundraising advantage, and you want to kind of take that away as best you can in the intervening days between Liberal leadership and a campaign, number two. Number three is you don't want to give Jagmeet Singh an opportunity for any kind of self-righteousness. He's made himself perfectly irrelevant, and I think they want to allow him to continue to keep himself perfectly irrelevant. With regard to what was just said, too, about, about the tightening of the polls and the falling off the NDP, I think that's a correct observation. And I think we see history repeating itself a little bit going back to 2011 when Stephen Harper won a majority government. And he said very clearly to Canadians, in a time of crisis, we want a government, a steady, stable majority government that'll focus on the economy. And I think for a lot of Canadians, the rationale for that rings true today, which is in a time we've had now back-to-back minority parliaments, which has had all of its sort of messiness and dysfunction. And I think Canadians want to have a clear government with a clear mandate to square up and represent Canadians. And I think it's a perfect rationale for an election campaign on a very significant and one of the most important issues that we could possibly have, which is our relationship to the United States. And so clarity, a majority government, and two national choices is what Canadians will be looking for.
Your thoughts, Scott, on the prospect of that election happening as soon as, or a campaign launched as soon as within the next month, and also on what a campaign will be or how a campaign could be different than the last few weeks. Rob Gibbs was on one of my shows this week, and he was saying, like, the advantage the Liberals have right now, which we've discussed at length, could dissipate pretty quickly in a campaign where each team is on a more even footing.
Look, if I had $1 for every dime store Cassandra who told me that they're absolutely certain what Mark Carney's going to do when he becomes leader and prime minister, I could buy Mar-a-Lago, which would be very tempting, because then I would shutter the joint. But look, you can make James just made a persuasive case for why it makes sense to go early. Or go immediately, should we say. I can make an equally persuasive case, and history gives us lots of examples both ways as to why you might want to hold on, get insulated into the job, show that you've had some on-the-job training, distinguish yourself from Justin Trudeau. The truth of the matter is there's no crystal ball to gaze into. There will be polling data that will be available to Mark Carney. It will be a situation that he will confront once he's in that position. And as we know, things are moving constantly. Donald Trump lights the skies up on almost a daily basis. So I don't think that there is a decision that's been made. I don't think there's even a good way to bet on this. I think it's going to be a situational decision based on rational choice and a smart risk assessment.
Shannon, I would not call you, what was it, dime store Cassandra or myself, but what are your thoughts on the prospect of going sooner to the polls?
Well, certainly Trump has upended everything in terms of Canadian political calculation and Canadian political loyalties. And we're seeing that, as Scott says, moving on a day-to-day basis. However, there are a couple of certainties. One, we have a deadline of somewhere around March 3rd or 4th for Trump's first self-imposed deadline around tariffs. And then we have another one that came through the executive order on April 1st. In there will be a lot of push and pull, I think, and a lot of different messages being sent from the White House. But the other piece of this is that the Liberals are going to want to move as quickly as possible, given the weakness of the NDP and the Bloc in some of the numbers that we are seeing. They are not going to want to do as Trudeau has done and do a deal with either of those parties, it seems. And if I'm the NDP right now, what I'm doing is focusing my resources in a laser-targeted way on those incumbents and on the winnable seats in every possible respect to be able to shore up what they have, because right now things are looking very, very tough for them, and they want to be able to respond to that reality.
Just jumping off that, James, the polling does very clearly show, like, the Conservatives have, let's say, lost between 3 and 5 points depending on where they are, but they're still at very high levels, 38, 39, 40%. The gains that Mark Carney, a so-called, Mark Carney-led Liberal Party, have made so far in all these polling, and all this polling has been, as Shannon points out, almost entirely at the expense of the NDP in such a short period of time. Yet most of the messaging from Mark Carney is around very similar things that we've heard from Conservatives, building energy infrastructure and balancing the budget, things like that. Like, how do you square that?
Well, I mean, I think it's really rational. As I said before, New Democrats have made themselves irrelevant, right, by hitching themselves to Justin Trudeau. Justin Trudeau leaves, and they're just kind of standing in the wilderness. Canadians also tend to not vote retrospectively. They vote for tomorrow. They vote for the challenge that's ahead. They vote for what's next, not for what was last. And so Jagmeet Singh standing there saying, we had a confidence and supply agreement, and we got dental care for at-risk youth and elderly who can't afford dental care. People go, well, that's good, but Donald Trump's in front of us. We have tariffs in front of us. We have a shaky economy, low productivity, and we have, what's your plan for going forward? And so, the NDP is not a governing party. They're just not. And Jagmeet Singh is, he's the weakest New Democrat leader that I've seen in my lifetime. And I think Canadians are just saying, look, we want two governing alternatives. And the fortunate thing for this country is we have them. We have Pierre Poilievre, 20 years in politics, former cabinet minister, bilingual, thoughtful, presenting a vision, an approach, and a style. And Mark Carney, who's, former governor of the Bank of Canada, Bank of England, his resume, bilingual, thoughtful guy who's presenting himself in the way in which, he presents himself publicly. And let's have a good debate about who these two people, not just in terms of platform, but in terms of character, substance, style, we want to be the voice of Canada and to bring us together and to face this existential threat for the coming 4 years. That's a good debate with two good choices, and I think the country will be well served by it.
Do you think it will be that binary, Scott? It will be between those two? Like, do you think this NDP thing is permanent?
Well, I don't know if it's permanent, but I think that it certainly is. Jagmeet Singh is an anchor on his party, and the issue set, Trump, tariffs, the turbulence economically that we're confronted by suddenly in a U.S. that is no longer a partner or an ally or even a modest friend. I think all of that works to the disadvantage of anyone who's not Mark Carney or Pierre Poilievre. And I actually think, to James's point, I'm in really strong agreement with James. Like, I think we've seen this kind of consensus emerge. I mean, there are small differences, but really no carbon tax, no capital gains. We've got to start to look at other markets to diversify our trade. We're going to have to deal with Trump. I mean, there's a broad consensus on what we need to do next. So the critical question that Canadians will face in the next election is, which one of these guys do you trust best to do it? And if Mark Carney, when he becomes Prime Minister, looks at a set of data that says on the critical question of who can best confront Trump and tariffs, if he wins that question, then he will call an election, because as we've seen in the Ontario election, that's all that's on people's minds right now, and likely all to be on people's minds for a while.
Last word to you, Shannon.
Well, I think one of the reasons why a lot of this is happening is that Pierre Poilievre is a uniquely polarizing political figure. And so progressive voters are now finally looking at their choices. And at least right now, parking with Mark Carney, he has a very difficult line to walk, though, in terms of keeping that voting coalition together. And Mr. Poilievre also has work to do in terms of his unfavorables, which are extremely high, particularly among women. That's what I'm going to be watching for going forward.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Shannon Phillips, James Moore, and Scott Reed, our Sunday strategy session. Thanks so much. Appreciate it.